Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week for something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. And today's guest is the fabulous author, poet, novelist, librettist, and sporadic puppeteer, Caroline Hardaker. Caroline's debut poetry collection, Ovation, was published by Valley Press in 2017, and her first full-length collection, Little Quakes Every Day, was published by Valley Press in November 2020. Caroline's debut novel, Composite Creatures, was published by Angry Robot in April 21, and her second novel, Mothtown, was published by Angry Robot in November 2023. She has work featured in Washington Post, The Guardian, and New Scientist, and she was shortlisted for a Golden Tentacle Award, the Kitschies, as well. So I'm very honored to have you on the show, Caroline. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, I wanted to start with your poetry. Because that's where you started as well, your publishing journey. So how did you when you brought that lyrical quality into the prose of your later two novels, like, can you tell us a little bit about your poetry?
I can. So I started poetry. I like talking about poetry because I'm not the traditional way in. I think people think people who are poets studied poetry. They've done courses at the poetry school. They've done degrees, PhDs, but I was not one of those people at all. I literally started it as a bit of an experiment. I was writing a lot of non-fiction, funnily enough. I did want to write stories. The idea of writing a novel was way too daunting. So that idea of fitting a story on one page or even a snapshot of a story, that was it. You don't even need to do a complete story. You can just do like a little vignette or a little snapshot of someone's day, and then that can be your poem. And also to just be able to be quite lyrical and tongue twistery and make up phrases about things and see things in a completely new way. It just appealed to me, but I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I just thought I'll have a go at that. And I started to Google, and I discovered that poems as well could literally be about anything. Because before that I was a bit naive, I guess. I just presumed, because I barely even read poetry, a little bit, but not really. I thought it all had to be very personal, or an ode to love. But I discovered that just as easily you can have a poem about like a yeti or a vampire or anything you like, the sunset, a flower, anything. So I started experimenting with that, and I found it really freeing. And then I started to read more, learn more about contemporary forms, but just most importantly, just like practice the way sounds sounded and words sounded when they're in a sentence, and how different sentences had different effects when you use long ones and short ones, and where you put a pause has such a big effect on how something is said, or a line break. And then I'd done that for a few years and was reading them places, having single poems published in journals and anthologies, and then I did my collections, which to me was like my first leap to writing a novel, because though they are separate poems, they create one entity together. So Ovation, all the poems in it are different ways of exploring bones, but they're almost joined by this theme of having foundations at their heart, whether they're really strong foundations, like a woman who falls in love with a mountain, or whether it's a woman made of paper whose her foundations are a lot softer. So it formed in my mind what is like a novel but told through verse. I ended up writing my first novel purely because I was asked to write several science fiction poems for a magazine in Edinburgh. And I was sitting in the living room. I was looking around, and my cat walked in, and I wrote one about a sort of cat thing. And then I remember looking at it later, and it was an awful poem, to be fair. It was terrible. It was really just prose. But I remember thinking, oh, maybe that concept could be a short story. And then I just started to bullet point it out because I had no idea how to write a novel either. And then I thought, maybe it could be a novella. Maybe this could be it. And because nobody needed it, there was no pressure. I thought I could just try this. And then I started to write it, and it got longer and longer and longer. And then eventually it finished. And I thought, actually, it's a novel. And then I was just like, I can't believe it. But throughout it, I'd seen it in the same way as when I was writing poetry. So I tried to be quite experimental in the way I was telling it. So revealing things slowly, doing it through first person. So everything was a bit askew and everything was twisted by the way she saw things. I was fascinated by that because the main thing about poetry in my eyes is it's wonderful because it gives us a completely new way of looking at old things. And I think first person narrative does the same thing because we don't all see things in the same way. We see things completely differently. So that's how that book came about. And then I just did another one because I loved doing that. I loved being able to, it's like writing a poem, but it's like, I almost say it's like writing a piece of music, or what I like writing a piece of music to be, because I'm not musical in any way at all, but it's like creating beats in certain places, creating rhythms, creating pace, and all of that. You can have like lyrics throughout which carry you through the song. So that's how I ended up moving from poetry to novels. And each time I write a novel, I'm trying to do something different, a new experiment, I guess. But that's what keeps it interesting. So yeah, that's my story.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you kind of fell into writing novels in a way because of following a story. And I think that is such a big part of storytelling, isn't it, in novel writing, is that you look where the characters take you and you allow the characters to lead you. And the story is as long as it has to be. And, you might think it's a short story, but then you think there's so much meat in there. There's so many answers that I need to sort of pull out from the story, or questions, some ways I'm more interested in questions than I am the answers.
I've always said that I think short stories are the hardest thing ever, because a poem, it's just like a snapshot. A novel is a big exploration of someone's life, because I like character studies really. But a short story, to keep something succinct and explore a story and explore a character and have a bit of narrative so it's not a complete snapshot, I think that's near impossible. I've tried to do it and it just sprawls out.
You say that, no. But you are such a liar, because you did do it very successfully in in the anthology that I sort of organized and illustrated, Whispers in the Earth. So Caroline had agreed to sort of write a short story for this anthology, and it's basically short story in poetry form. So it's about Persephone, and it's an extremely successful short story. So and a lot of, I find actually that a lot of your poetry, the poems itself, you say they're vignettes, and sometimes short stories can be vignettes, I think, and you do tell little stories through the poems. So they're not merely impressions. It feels like they're little stories. And you seem to be also,
so.
They definitely feel this way to me, and like you seem to be drawn to sort of mythological retellings for poetry as well.
I am. I think you're right. Like whenever I've tried to talk about Ovation or Little Quakes Every Day to people, particularly people who aren't poetry readers, which is a lot of people, I tend to call them kind of poem stories, because I want people to see that there is a little story in there. It might not all be explicitly told, but there's hints towards the past, and there's hints towards their future, and there's hints to where they're going and what they want and why they're there. And it's all there. It's just a bit coded, I guess, a bit more cryptic, which I quite like, because I like the puzzle element of that. I like the ambiguity. So I find it particularly fun. And I
Do
hope
you
other
think
people do.
poetry lends itself to that ambiguity in storytelling? Do you think?
I do. I think poetry is a really good one to discuss with people. And I mean, you can do this with prose as well, now that I think about it. But part of the fun of stories is the stories that people read in different ways, because I always think you apply yourself to a story when you read it, whether it's a poem or a short story or a novel. And it belongs to the author to a degree, but then once it's published, it kind of belongs to the reader. And 5 different readers will read a story in 5 completely different ways. They'll take different meanings from stuff. They'll like different characters. They'll hate other characters. They will perhaps even interpret the ending completely differently. And I think poetry sort of enhances that, because the language itself is ambiguous, not just the story itself. And it can really like trigger things in people, or people might see different correlations between different sequences of words. And poetry, you often, at a base level, you do find words in odd formations. You find them in odd sequences that might not mean anything to an obvious eye, but then you really have to think about it. And that's when you pull yourself out and twist it into yourself. And I absolutely love that. Like, I absolutely loved it, because it's like once you've created something, it's still alive in a way. It's still living and being interpreted, and it'll change through time. Hopefully people will be reading it in the future, and then they'll see it a different way. So yeah. Yes.
I think it's a very multi-layered and sophisticated way of thinking about storytelling in general, and like especially story writing and novel writing, which is that the readers and the audience are part of that storytelling journey, isn't it? And and I think we see it because as writers, we're kind of isolating ourselves as much as we can sometimes in order to kind of preserve like our sanity in how we think about a story. But when you see movies being adapted, books being adapted into movies or TV series, and then you see the reaction of the writers sometimes and how different the text is, and that's all part of the interpretation of this next person, the audience of a book, that creates a new audience. And speaking of adaptations, you're also a librettist. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how did your poetry sort of lead you into that?
Yeah, it's something I haven't done tons of, but I love so much. So oh gosh, when was it? A few years ago, I started to work with a composer who was at the Royal Northern College of Music, and together we created an opera. So basically, she had read some of my poetry and she thought, these would be really good lyrics. Would you consider writing some pieces especially for this? And together we decided to do it on folk tales, which is very up your street. And you can see it. I'm sure it's still viewable online. It was performed in London, I think in 2021. It feels like the last few years have just been a blur. But yes, it involves several stories about women in mythology from around the world. So we've got Medusa, kind of a modern interpretation of her. We've got a Scottish witch in there. We've got Halya from Hindu mythology, and they're all women who have been interpreted in particular ways, and we've tried to tell it from their perspective. I found the process of writing it very similar to poetry. There was a lot more constraints which I didn't stick to at all in some places, because what the composer was creating, Charlotte Marlowe, was what is referred to as art songs, which was a new concept to me. But it's like, I say this word a lot today, but it's like very experimental. It's a very haunting, beautiful way of telling a story through very little, mostly music, but very little words. So sometimes she was requesting just a line, which could be the song, and from that she could spin like 2 minutes of music. I found that very hard. So in lots of cases, I wrote a lot more than that.
Yeah.
And it became more of an opera rather than an art song experience. And yeah, it was performed. And, you know, seeing it performed was just, it took my breath away because I suppose it's probably a little bit like what it's like to see your characters come to life in a film or so. But to see people with the most incredible voices singing and interpreting and acting out the stories of these women, but also just, again, it's like pouring themselves into it. Like they were shaping it in a way that I couldn't even have imagined. And I was part of like the ideation process. It was absolutely magical. And they still use it, I think, at the college for various projects. And I think they've done a new interpretation of one of the pieces, which was amazing. So I hope I can do more. We've talked about maybe doing other things as well in the future. So um it was just magical, absolutely magical. And yeah,
I mean,
came very easily.
it sounds like an absolutely incredible experience. And I think the sort of musicality of your poetry itself is, it's so like poetry is so related to music, and you know, it's just the way you use the language, and it just sounds incredible. I
I'd
need
love
to
to be
watch it
musical.
actually.
Like I think people who write like music, not just the lyrics, but the music, I think it is such a talent that I can't even imagine. When I listen to a piece of music, I feel like I can't separate all the layers of it. It's just one experience. And I think a lot of people feel like that about books as well. They think, how could somebody piece together all these layers? But if you've got that sort of mind, it makes sense. But I could literally never do that with music. It's
Well,
too
you
amazing.
say that,
No,
but
I can't.
you also thought, oh, I can't write a novel or whatever, you know,
Well,
once upon a time.
I always wrote things. I always wanted to write a novel,
Yeah.
but I know my limitations, and I definitely could not write a piece of music. I'm really tone
Well,
deaf.
that's there's like a technical skill that goes into this, but
There
I think
is.
is a little bit
That's what I
demanding.
lack.
However, the musicality of the language you use in your writing is something that I was going to ask you about, because both your novels, you know, they're certainly character driven, but I would argue that they're also language driven. So how did your poetry influence your prose work?
I think it's before, and I think if I'd just gone into writing novels without doing poetry first, my novels would have a completely different sound than they do. I think when I was doing poetry, it was a real process of exploring what's possible. And it taught me the effects, the amazing effects of words in a certain order and sounds and pauses and breaks. And that was something, even though I read so many books, so many prose books before that for my whole life, and I was writing non-fiction, it was something I don't think I had grasped to the same level, because most prose books aren't written like that. They're written in their own way, and that's the way that they're supposed to be written, but they're not written in a lyrical way. And I wasn't reading very many lyrical books. I was just reading regular prose. But when I was writing poetry, I think I just found a huge love of twisting things in unusual ways to make people feel things. And it did that. I saw it on people's faces or in the comments when they would read something in an anthology that I had done. And it was 10 lines, but they went, oh, and it left them with this sense. And that was what I was trying to do. I thought, God, if you can do that in a poem, imagine if you could do that in a whole novel. So because I had quite a lot of practice in it, it kind of came quite naturally. It takes a lot out of you to do it for a whole novel, I guess. And you do have to tone it down. I think I'm quite guilty, especially in my earlier drafts, of everything being a bit much. Let's put it that way. And then I have to go through and I have to tease it out because too much lyricism ends up being unreadable. Even I agree with that. You need to have it in the right place for the right effect. And I've just never quite found anything which matches it in terms of its effect on people and how it can perturb people and disturb people, which I quite like to do given the tone of my books. I think I just want to leave a lasting impression. And I know how moved I am by particular quotes that I read. And I'd love to be that for other people as well. But I also just enjoy the process. I wouldn't enjoy it half as much if I wasn't trying to create things that sound different, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why people do remember your books. Like when they read your books, they remember them. It's and that kind of unsettling moment where you have I think in general, like in horror genre, for example, like it can be used in the or like, you know, in the gothic kind of genres, it can be used like something that's familiar, but then you introduce a slightly unfamiliar element to it. So you when you have the you know,
the
uncanny, and I think you do it to a very good effect in your prose, where you know, it's just like one word that's sort of switched out of place, and it makes you pause and makes you sort of take it in a different way, or it creates even like a subconscious level of sort of tension.
That's what I enjoy when reading as well. So not if I read something that's completely out there, that's great. But the weirdest things for me, the things that make my gut kind of go, oh, are the things where you just think, this is all fine. And then there's just one detail which isn't what you expect, or is inside out, or back to front, or there's something, and you think it's so much more real. I think it could almost be real. And I think that's where the twist comes. And yeah, it's that uncanny thing. That is something that I've always loved when I've read or watched films or anything. And I didn't quite know what that was until later when I did start to read about these things. And I thought, that's what that is. It's an actual phenomenon. And I do try, I especially Composite Creatures, I would say. I have played with that quite significantly, and it often comes across in what I like to do is I never thought about it when I was writing it, but afterwards it gets referred to as body horror a bit, because I never saw myself as a horror writer at all, and I still don't think I am a horror writer. I don't know what I particularly am. I don't think these are, I mean, Mothtown, I keep saying to people when I find it, it's still in bookshops, but if you go into Waterstones, I've seen it in the general fiction, I've seen it in science fiction and fantasy, I've seen it in the horror section. Even they don't know what it is, which can be an issue with publishing, but I kind of like
as
it.
long as they don't put it in the non-fiction, I think we're fine, and I'll explain why in a second. I don't think that it's like, I wouldn't describe your writing as body horror necessarily. Like, it's basically, there's the unsettling elements, but for me, body horror would be slightly would require sort of more horror, you know. Like, I feel like the unsettling elements of it are I don't know how you describe
I agree with you. I do agree with you. But then again, I think we come back to that same argument about the story belongs to the author and the reader. And I think for some people, their boundaries are just in a different place. And
I just feel like it's very subtle, basically, what you do.
I like that. I feel like that's more creepy, because when things start going totally crazy, I think my suspension of disbelief works. It's different. Like I feel like I start to lose that connection to the reality of the book. But whereas if it's very subtle, if it's tiny things here and there that have this creeping sense of dread, that's when I'm still living in that book, and it's like a real place. So I guess ultimately everyone always says, you know, write what you love to do, or write what you love. And I do that, obviously. I think you'd be able to tell if I didn't enjoy it.
the reason I wouldn't want to see your books in a nonfiction department is that a little segue. Yeah. So basically, going into the creepy kind of elements of it is that both of Caroline's novels, Composite Creatures and Mothtown, are near future dystopian novels. And they both feel very real. Like they don't feel like, you know, oh, some like dreadful plague has to happen. It feels like we're almost there, almost on the cusp of those possibilities. And I feel like they both focus intimately on the kind of ethical journeys of humans who ill fit into the world. So, you know, neither of your characters are like heroic or, you know, particularly extraordinary. You know, like, why did you decide on focusing on such characters?
I think with both of those books, I think I've tried to explore particular things. And with Composite Creatures, when I wrote that tiny little poem thing that became the outline, already in that little piece, it was about someone who was closing out the truth willingly. So it was somebody who wanted to get through something without really addressing the horror of what they were doing. And so that was at the core of that story. And as I wrote it, it became about exploring complacency and what can happen if we just drift through situations and we don't think about what we're doing, or we go with the flow in very problematic situations. And for me, that's a very real problem in the world. And I'm quite interested in reading about real problems, even if they are in completely unnatural settings. Mothtown, similarly, it's about someone who struggles to fit in and someone who struggles to communicate. And as the book goes along, some very weird things happen, but ultimately it's about a man who can't communicate with people and the knock-on consequences of that as he gets older. And also grief, when somebody can't communicate and is wrapped up and lost in their own grief. So for me, to explore these sorts of themes, it would be pretty much impossible to write about a hero in those contexts, because I feel like the most interesting explorations are someone who's going to go down this dark path, and I'm interested in where the dark path lends. One day I might write something about a hero, but at the moment I think I just want to like look into the psychology of people.
Of course. For my sake, please don't do anything different. I love your novels as they are.
Good. Because I don't have any plans to write anything about the perfect being. Like, and I mean, you could debate like even a hero, the traditional hero has his dark side, but it's not enough for me. I think I like exploring the darker elements of our everyday lives, like grief and not talking to people and complacency and indifference. And they're just absolutely fascinating to me. They're like psychological studies, and I just, when I write a book and when I plan a book, they're always at their heart a character study. So there's plot, there's stuff that happens, but generally they're about how a person copes with things or gets through things. And if they were just the traditional hero, we all know what they would do. They would fight against things. They would fight the beast. They would do this.
But not even necessarily, you know, heroic. I think you chose a difficult writing path in both your novels, in that it's easier to write a book about someone who's proactive, who goes and he like and does things, right, and gets things done, whether they're for good or evil. That's, you know, you can have anti-heroes, you can have, you know, villains as heroes, you can have, you know, or you can have ordinary people who just, you know, take action to change their life, to, you know, to create that sort of spark that like ignites the plot. But I feel like your novels are being pushed forward by the main character's passivity. And that I think is
Yeah.
really difficult to do. How do you handle that and like balance it out with needing to push the book forward?
Any drafts is the answer for that. I've talked about this before. I think I write in layers, and I think I have to explore who that person is more with each layer. So with each layer, I can add in a layer that keeps the intrigue going, which keeps the sense of dread going, which keeps the story going forwards. Otherwise, the idea of someone who is passive and stagnant and not even reacting in some respects sounds terrible. It sounds like it's a person who just doesn't do anything, but that isn't true, because by our inaction, we are making a stand for something. So in Composite Creatures, when the main character Nora, she gets involved with um, a healthcare organization called Eastern Grove, which is like a private healthcare system. If you can afford it, you can join, and they help you with all sorts of things. And she has a little bit of a windfall from her mother, and she joins. And she goes with whatever they will help her with, because she thinks, well, they're supposed to help me. That's their job. You know, they're meant to enhance my life. And as she gets deeper in, I think she feels more powerless about what she can actually have agency with in her own life. And she has so much trust in them that she just goes with it, even when it goes into a darker and darker place. So technically, she isn't being active in her own life, but by her not being active in her own life, things are getting worse and worse and worse, and she is having to react to agree to those. So I find that quite interesting, because there's so much of our actual real lives that we don't react against. Like people don't protest everything. People don't campaign against every cause that they would want to. We don't make a stand about everything. We try and do what we can, but most of us don't do everything. And I think that's interesting. And I think how that plays on someone's psychology is interesting. So I just keep exploring that, really.
And I think that like near dystopian future, the way it frames this passivity is really interesting as well, because you mentioned that we do what we can, but the truth is that the modern world is so complicated. Like everything is so complicated. Like every bite that we eat, like we have no real control over where that food comes from. Like even obviously less so if someone lives in the States, right? Like where there's basically no food control at all. And people can write whatever the hell they want on the packaging. So
True.
But even here, where technically we're supposed to have more stringent sort of regulation about food safety, we don't really know, like there's ways about things. So you think you're doing like eating ethically, and then it turns out that the food that was packaged locally actually came from some like dreadful place in
I know.
the
I used
country.
to Well, I've worked in the past, years ago, I worked for a fair trade organization. I wrote stories for them about their producers and so on. And even just my short time there, it really opened my eyes to the trail that food, clothes, furniture, every single item in our lives has gone through to get to where we are. And people just don't know. They think they do, but they don't. They have no idea. And we're all complicit in it. We can buy fair trade, we can buy ethical, we can spend as much as we can knowing that the person at the end and all the people who transported it and packaged it and held it in the factory or whatever got paid properly. But it's a sad truth that I don't think our society as it is set up for us to be able to do that with literally everything. And there's not even avenues to buy everything in a fair trade manner yet. I hope one day there is, but I think you can just, it's so hard. It's so hard.
I think in terms of, there's also the exhaustion of being bombarded with too many choices, too many things to worry about, too many, you know, too much illusion of choice.
Yes.
And you know, on that subject, the thing that for me illustrated it best, and it sounds like a satire, but it's not. It was a real situation. So there was an online supermarket, because I wanted to buy some kind of natural product. I don't even remember what it was. I just wanted to buy some kind of coconut fiber sponges, say, to make up an example.
Been there. Yeah.
And you know, I was looking at the supermarket and all the products, and many products, and they had like all those filter options, and one of the filter options was choose your ethics, right? And you could pick vegan, you could pick eco-friendly, you could pick kind of, you know, fair trade equivalent, so basically like ethically sourced.
Yeah.
But if you tried to pick all of them, you'd have 0 products.
Yeah, there's nothing
right?
left.
Like,
yeah.
so many vegan products are basically made of plastic, right?
Yeah.
Vegan leather, vegan, you know, textiles, other textiles, you know, like everything wrapped in plastic. So it's just really difficult, because people think they're making the correct or the most correct ethical choice they can, right? And they, you know, like, I especially feel bad when you see people who, for ethical reasons, choose to be, you know, vegans, and this is a choice that requires so much effort and so much, you know, and sacrifice, and, you know, like, just work. You know, the labor that goes into, you know, being a healthy vegan is difficult. You know, it's difficult. So I'm full of respect for that. However, the way that our system of life is set up means that they have to close their eyes to certain bad things that they chose to make. You know, if you consume a lot of soy products, they might come from, you know, Brazil and like deforestation areas. In which case, you know, from the point of view of the environment, you'd be better off having a steak, frankly.
Yeah.
You know, from a grasslands, you know, like.
I know, or like, I shouldn't even raise it because it's so much of a debate, but like, you go down the palm oil route, you know, that's in literally everything. It's like pizzas, toothpaste, everything.
However,
and you can get ethical palm oil. It's just people won't. Well, companies won't buy it because it's too expensive.
Well, but that's a problem. So certain, like, there's companies that claim that they're buying ethical palm oil, and the problem with palm oil is also that technically it is the best source of oil, because it produces the most oil, and it's you know, it uses up the least water. So as long as you plant them somewhere that didn't used to be a rainforest, like, that is the most ethical oil source.
Yeah, there's one producer in, I think it's Ghana, and it has the greatest yields. Like, you can plant it naturally, like amongst other plants, so it doesn't destroy the landscape. Like, animals use those trees, live on those trees as well. Like, palm trees are natural, they're not an artificial tree. But yeah, if you think about replacing it with some other type of oil, you'd take far more land to gather the same amount of oil. It's insane. But people, again, don't think people really realize that. They just think palm oil's bad, but the bit that's bad is the deforestation that occurs to plant it in Indonesia and places like that.
Absolutely.
It's just so difficult, though, for the general person to navigate it, because we're not in control as much of the big situation out there, and that's what we have to navigate, and it's just too hard.
And that, I feel like, is the most realistic part of your novels, because, you know, your novels are, you know, near future dystopia, so they're technically speculative fiction. However, I feel like the choices the characters make and their also response feels very realistic, very natural, because it takes a huge amount of mental and emotional labor to navigate those situations where you as an individual, you know, in a very fractured society, feel very powerless, don't you?
I remember a review of Composite Creatures when it came out, and they gave it a great review. And one thing that they said was like, when they were reading it, at first, before they got like the hang of the way it was written, they presumed it would be about somebody taking down a huge corporation or somebody taking down this private healthcare Eastern Grove. Like they would be part of it, and then they would realize it was bad, they'd infiltrate it and take it down. And that didn't happen in the book. It
I
doesn't
think it
happen.
would have
And
been
they
a
were
much
relieved.
worse book if that's what
Yeah, well,
if
that's
it
what they
happens like that
said. They
way.
were like, and you know what? I was so relieved, because if that had happened, it would have just been like, it's another story. But because it didn't, it went in a way that it didn't expect, and it explored an area that they hadn't really seen before. And I thought that was great. That was like exactly what I wanted to do. And obviously it stayed with them because they wrote that review. So yeah. So yes, if people like reading about consequences, they should give it a go.
Because I feel like that's what most of us do. You know, we can't even process all the stuff that all the choices that we like, the small choices we make in a day-to-day life. And so just for our sanity, we have to close our eyes to so much.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's true.
and I mean, it sounds like I'm absolutely absolving your characters of any personal responsibility, but you know, I don't, you know, I don't mean to do so. I think it's more that the strength of your novels is in how much exactly we can identify with characters that feel so helpless and passive and weak, and that's the disturbing thing.
They make very real choices, like choices that I know people would make who I know. And you know what? I'm not saying I would do any different either. And it's not to say that by the end of the books they win by their indecision. It there are very real and solid consequences for them too, which they have to live through and with. And I think how people cope with that is very interesting as well. And it's also kind of, because I like writing in first person too, it's not just about their passivity, it's about how they justify their actions to a reader. Because they won't see it exactly how we do. They think they're doing the right thing at the right time, and maybe they reflect later, or maybe they don't. Maybe they just that they can end in some situation that, if you just describe it to someone out of context, might seem truly horrifying. But to them, the sequence has been so slow and step, they don't even realize how bad the situation is because they've justified the means to get there. And I kind of like that too. I like understanding and exploring the lies that we tell ourselves to justify the things that we do.
And that is very disturbing as well, like emotionally, I think. And like, you know, good view you sort of touched on that, because, you know, both the main characters in your novels are decidedly unreliable narrators. So can you tell us a little bit about that and the choices you made in this regard?
Yeah. So it's like, I wouldn't say they're liars. Do they lie? They may tell a little lie here and there, but it's like an emotional lie. So it's like, oh, it's like perception based. They're not lying to us. I'm telling the whole story through the perception of someone that is fooling themselves. And to be honest, when I do it, I feel like I'm being an actor. I try and step into their shoes. It's almost like an actor doing a monologue to a degree, rather than someone writing a once upon a time, they went there, they did this. And I like that performance element of it, and that comes across in how the tone of voice is different to a regular. The tone of voice for each character is different, or the the way they talk about themselves and the way they talk about other people, and then they might describe something one way, but then you can slip into a piece of dialogue by another character which describes the same thing, but it's describing it in a completely different way. And I like that, because then you start feeling destabilized by it, and you think, which one is the truth? What is happening here? And I think that can happen very much in real life as well, because it's memory. And I also kind of like writing in past tense. Not like everything I do is past tense, but it's like how you distort things when you remember them. We all do it. None of us have, well, I said, maybe if you've got a photographic memory, maybe this is an exception. But generally, people tell emotional truths all the time. And I think everyone's had a situation where they have been absolutely certain that they've described something as it happened, and then they find out that that didn't actually happen. It happens to me all the time. And it happens in crime scenes a lot. You know, they think, oh, that was a red car that went past, but actually it wasn't. It was green or blue. And again, it's the psychology of this, and why we convince ourselves, why we have to convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing, or that what we're doing is meaningful. Why can't we just happily go with things that we think are wrong or be wrong? And I'm absolutely fascinated by people in their own heads and how people live their lives. And I think ultimately, every time I write something, I want to find out how somebody else lives their life, and I'm just being an actor when I do it. So I guess that's it.
I think it's a beautiful way of looking at it, and I think you're touching on something that is quite universal in terms of memory and recollection, and because what you described is an experience that everyone has had, and I think it's very difficult to admit to that, even about events that don't matter sometimes. Because, you know, even if you have, you know, the perfect sight and the perfect hearing, like we have a very fragmented impression of the world and events around us at all times. And I feel like memories are essentially storytelling that we do to complete the image, the imperfect image that we have at all times. So, you know, we fill in those gaps because that's the only way our brains can actually remember things. And that those filled in bits are where we kind of maybe embellish based on our own self-perception or perception of others. And, you know,
that's it. It's self-perception, because ultimately a lot of it is to save face, even if we don't think it is saving face. And I think we're all living our lives wearing some sort of mask, and we work very hard without realizing it to convey that mask to other people. And that mask might be just who we think we are, but in everything we do and say, we're kind of trying to confirm that in some way to people, try and reaffirm who we are or who we want to be. And these characters do that too. They try and save face. They try and tell things in a way they think makes sense, rather than a way that we would think makes sense. And that can lead to quite a few uncanny descriptions of things, because you think, gosh, well, if they see this situation like that, that could be problematic later on when they do X, Y, Z. And I like that, because then there's a sense of dread there as well. It's like, what are they going to do? What could they do? I wouldn't like to know any of these characters in real life, I have to admit. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we all probably know a few people like that in reality. To an extent, it's just that they're not faced with extreme choices that you put in front of your characters. And
and they're very close to happening, especially Composite Creatures, because it's like a very near future, but it's also could very well be a parallel present, because all you need to have done to make the reality in Composite Creatures possible is to manage one scientific thing which people haven't quite managed yet. Well, so we think, but since that book came out, there has been things in the news where people are edging a little bit closer to the horrible truth at the core of Composite Creatures. And it won't be good when it happens, but it's human nature to keep trying to get to these places. So we're so close. It could almost be the present, and then it won't even be like science fiction anymore. It'll just be science fact. So I find that really interesting as well. The truth.
Yeah, I think it's also, you know, how we're whether or not we get to that point is going to depend on whether we allow ourselves to accept the kind of people in authority, people who, you know, make the money, people who kind of lead us in this direction. And you know, and sometimes when I see you know, people who are very popular in real life now and who have this is like going a little bit off topic, but who have a vision that to me personally feels extremely dystopian, and yet they're kind of barreling towards it. Like one example is Elon Musk, who quite rather famously is belongs to this kind of pro-natalist group that consists essentially of very, very rich white people who consider themselves to be, you know, almost like they see it as their duty towards mankind to produce as many of their perfect progeny as possible. And they also see it as their duty to allow for space travel so that human colonies can preserve the human race elsewhere as we destroy our planet. And as they do that, of course, they, you know, especially with the rockets and whatnot, they're using up the Earth's resources at an appalling rate in order to be able to create a colony of like-minded individuals on like some desolate rock in space.
Twisted, isn't it?
It is. And but the thing is that there's a lot of people who kind of buy into those stories, and they kind of, you know, they listen and they think, oh, this person's a genius, and it provides a sense of safety, I think, for them, that it's like, oh, well, I don't quite understand it, I'm fairly sure I wouldn't want to live on Mars, but you know, but this person is like, everyone says he's a genius, so he's probably a genius, right? So so he must know what he's talking about, so I'll just go with it because I can't do any of this. And you know, so people who kind of lean into that are bringing those dystopian sort of futures that much closer, isn't it?
They are, and they're intimidated by it too. Like they think it's something inaccessible that they couldn't understand even if they tried, which isn't always the case. But I think people are too daunted to even try and understand the ins and outs. They just trust people we are told to be intelligent, and then we get on to like the power of the media to convince and shape how we see the world. And that also has a role in both novels in terms of portraying how the protagonists see the situation, because they are constantly bombarded with ads or programming on news reports which tell a different story to they are actually experiencing. But then which one is the truth? You know, is it the trusted news channel, or is it just me, or am I crazy because I think of it as in a different way? And I think that's really destabilizing as well and dangerous. But again, that is like the reality that we live in, and we have to fight through fake news and real news every day to try and get to some sort of understanding. And we're in this really odd place where people are almost constructing their own realities by piecing together the bits of news that they particularly want to take on. And that's how we've ended up with some really dangerous and frankly dodgy ideologies out there. Yeah, it's crazy times.
I
crazy
think
days.
the really dangerous thing as well is when we rely on someone else retelling a story, because everyone's an unreliable narrator, and when you have someone else someone summarizing someone else's words. That's all it is their impression of that person's words, right? So unless you listen to it yourself, like, and you see it all the time, because people are too lazy to go and actually read the open letter, very too lazy to go and see the interview, or read the blog piece or whatever it is. So they rely on someone else doing it in like tweet form saying, oh, this person's evil and believes in eating babies. And you're just kind of, and hopefully we're getting more and more sort of questioning in some ways of that. And then we just sort of think, does this person actually believe that? Maybe I should check it. But very often it's just easier. We want to believe in the thing that's easier for us.
Yeah, we are, because we're all trying to, even if we think our well-being is in a really good way, we're all essentially trying to cope with life and get through life and make the best of it. And so we are our own unreliable narrators. We tell ourselves truths that help us get through situations and help us make decisions. And we're all filters. That's why, if I told you a story, then you told it to someone else, then they told somebody else, it's transformed because it's gone through my consciousness, through your consciousness and memory, and then through theirs, and then through theirs. And before you know it, it's a complete untruth that I wouldn't even recognize. And so in that sense, it's getting very philosophical now, but in that sense, what even is truth? Like, what is the core truth when it comes to emotions and intellect and thoughts? Because we perceive the world all so differently. What is the core of that? Is there anything that is the same for any of us? And that's why reading books which are narrated through a particular filter is so interesting, because it's quite a rare insight into someone else's mind and someone else's perception, and you get to actually see things through their eyes rather than hear what they've said, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it is quite philosophical in that sense. Like, there's a big thing about storytelling as being a really amazing avenue for thought experiments in the philosophical community, being like, it's a way of exploring a thought experiment being like a Pavlov's dog sort of situation, but a story being the sequential consequence of lots of thought experiments, the consequences on an individual person's mentality and psyche and emotional state. It's a way of living through somebody else's eyes and in someone else's shoes, and such an opportunity. It's such an opportunity for readers and writers.
For sure. And I feel like that's what makes your novels and your poetry like feel very honest. The fact that it's not pretending to create like a sense of objective truth, and that you're happy to just leave it as it is, to have that kind of, sense that all we get is a vignette of someone else's life, someone else's consciousness, and
it's true.
And we will never know the truth, and we have to be content with that.
Yeah. We have to just take on face value what people tell us and what we perceive, but we can never truly know. And that's that's dystopian in itself, I think.
That's dystopian in itself, but it has an emotional, honesty to it, which I have to respect. So on that note, thank you so much for coming on the show. This hour just flew by.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I can't believe that was an hour. Could go on all night.
Absolutely. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.